Today we'll be talking about the solar system and all the great things that the solar system has. So we'll go through the entire solar system. We won't touch on the moon. Last week I talked about the Earth, moon, and sun and how cool that is. So if you missed that, it is available as a recording on the Facebook page. We also have the link to download. We'll do the talk. We'll answer a few questions as we go. We'll answer some questions at the end. And at the end of the talk, say around when we'll show you how to create your own scale solar system. So this is a great activity you can do at home to not only create the sizes of the planets and things in the solar system, but the distances. So it's a great activity to do while you're cooped up at home. And really get some hands-on, find things around the house to figure out how the sizes and distances would work and map it out. And you can really see how big the things are in the solar system relative to each other, and also how far away some of the things are. I think that's always one of the biggest surprises I have, is just how far away things in the universe could get. So we'll start in a few minutes. But yeah, so far I hope everyone's enjoyed it. On Friday, US time, Saturday, Australia time, we'll have actually the 30th anniversary of the Hubble Space Telescope. It's been up in space for that long. It was launched April 24th, 1990. And it's been doing some amazing science. So on the weekend, look out for a bunch of news stories and talking. And I'll talk about some, on Saturday, some of my favorite discoveries from the Hubble Space Telescope. There's a lot. So, a lot to get through. But it's a really cool thing happening. Now, the other thing to keep an eye out is in about 2 weeks, on the night of May 5th, so really early morning of May 6th, is the Eta Aquariid meteor shower. So this is an annual meteor shower. This year should be quite good. So there's no moon out. So you don't like the moon during a meteor shower because it makes the sky brighter, so you see less meteors. But it's going to be big, and it's a good time. So, you could, in a dark spot, see upwards of 30 to 50 meteors, and meteors are shooting stars, per hour. So it's a really great thing. So you'd have to wake up a bit early on May 6th, maybe about 4 a.m. It's a bit early, I know, but it'd be a really great opportunity to go see a really cool meteor shower. And that's visible all across Australia, so you don't have to be anywhere special to see it. And the best way to see a meteor shower is really just to go outside and look. You don't need a telescope or binoculars. You go outside, let your eyes adjust to the darkness for about 10-ish minutes, and then you'll start seeing those shooting stars. And shooting stars are just bits of broken rock. They're space rock burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. And as they travel through the Earth's atmosphere, they light up, they get really energetic, they get really hot, and that's what you see. And most of the shooting stars you'll see on that night are only about the size of maybe a grain of sand or a small pebble. They're actually really tiny. I think that's always the amazing thing about a meteor shower. So definitely don't miss that. We'll put out some reminders, obviously, in the next couple of weeks. But yes, as I said, so today we'll be talking about the solar system, kind of everything the solar system has. We'll just do a quick run through of the things. Some of the I think are the most fascinating, and some of them are the moons of some of these places. And we'll do that, and then we'll end with how to do your own scale solar system, and ask and take some questions as well. So if you type questions in the Facebook chat underneath the live video, we'll try and answer them as we go, and also we'll have time more at the end. So the solar system. So how many planets do we have? Well, if you caught Eloise's talk last week, she talked a little bit about what it means to be a planet and how to make a planet. So we do only have 8 planets in our solar system. We will talk about Pluto. Pluto is so special. Now, obviously, we start with, in our solar system, the closest planet to the sun, and that is Mercury. Now, Mercury has always been quite interesting to people. It doesn't have much of an atmosphere. It's almost as if this is what you would have on the inside of a planet, kind of the core of a planet. You can see there's very little atmosphere. You see lots of craters, impacts. It almost looks a little bit like the moon. There's lots of iron and rich elements in Mercury. But I think the most interesting thing about Mercury is its day and night. So last week we talked about how our Earth spins. We're spinning every 24 hours, and we're slightly tilted, and we go around the sun every 365.26225 days. Mercury doesn't do either. So one day on Mercury is actually quite strange. So a year on Mercury is 88 Earth days. So it takes 88 days for Mercury to go around the sun. So what that means? Well, it means you would actually have a birthday every 88 days. That's kind of cool. So every 3 months, you would have a birthday on Mercury, which is pretty cool. That would be a great thing, I think, to have. I wish I had a birthday every 3 months. But the strange thing about Mercury is 2 days spinning around. It takes 3 years to orbit around. So the days and years on Mercury are quite strange. So as you're standing on Mercury, and if you see the sun go across the sky, a day, you would actually have 2 years that have gone through on that planet. That's a really strange thing to think about. Mercury is a really strange place. It's something that scientists still are studying. There's what's called the Bepi-Colombo mission that just did a flyby of the Earth, and it's headed to Mercury to study it in lots of detail. And so hopefully lots more things that we'll start to understand and uncover about Mercury should happen in the short term. Now, what's the next planet? What comes after Mercury? Yes, Venus. Now, Venus sometimes is called Earth's sister or twin. Now, the reason we say that is it's fairly similar in size to Earth. It has a similar size. We think it could have been habitable, but Venus, that's where a lot of the similarities, where the same properties of the Earth end. Venus is on what we call a runaway greenhouse. So it's really hot on this planet. It is 462 degrees every single day. So when you wake up on Monday, 462 degrees. Tuesday, 462 degrees. It doesn't change. It is so, so hot on this planet. It also has a very thick atmosphere, and that atmosphere is mostly sulfur dioxide. And on the ground, probes have landed on Venus. No humans have been to Venus, but we've landed probes, things, satellites, little robots on Venus. The Russians landed quite a few, and this is actually a view of the ground. The little teeth at the bottom are from the actual probe, the rover itself. But you can see the ground. It's quite rocky and it's dirty. It's more volcanic-y almost. And when you look at the surface of Venus, this is what the probe saw: a very thick yellow atmosphere. And it's sulfur dioxide. It actually smells like rotten eggs. So not only is it hot, it stinks. It rains sulfuric acid. It rains acid from the skies. This place is almost terrible. It's really hard to survive Venus. And so one of the reasons we don't really talk about humans going to Venus, it's too hard. We can't survive living on there. Even our probes that go there can't survive living there. But it does have mountains and valleys. You can see here. This is one of the probes saw. So Venus is quite an interesting place, and it's something that we like to study because we think billions of years ago Venus may have been more similar to Earth than it is right now. That something has changed in the history of this planet. Something scientists want to know a lot about. So Mercury and Venus are the only two planets in our solar system that don't have moons. All the other planets have moons. Now, obviously, we talked about last week Earth's famous moon, and most of the other objects in the solar system, in fact, every other object that has a moon in our solar system has more than one moon. Earth is the only planet in our solar system to have one moon. Now, we talked a lot about Earth last week. This is a photo I like to show that's a little bit different. This is Earth with the satellites around it. So we have lots of satellites in orbit. We have about 5,000 satellites going around the Earth. Now, the scale here, the satellites are made a little bit bigger so we can see that, but there's lots of stuff floating around. And so if you were to visit us from another solar system and see Earth, we would look very different compared to all the other planets. All the other planets don't have these things really floating around it. Only Earth does. So our view of space and space's view of us is very different. And as we put more and more satellites up, some of these areas are getting blocked. This is something that people are trying to work on. We use satellites for lots of very important things, and we'll talk about this actually in a couple of weeks. But we also don't want to ruin our nighttime sky. We don't want to ruin the vision the universe and get to see all the great things about it. So this is something that we're trying to deal with and solve that is currently happening now. Does anyone know where this is? Well, it's not Earth. It kind of looks like Australia. It's Mars. So this is Mars, and it looks dusty and dirty, and it is. But one of the things I think you automatically see, and I always see in these sorts of photos when you look at Mars, is if you look in the middle here, if you can see my mouse, it looks like there's these cracks or crevices. We think places like this where water once was on the surface. We think there used to be a lot of water on Mars. Someone's asked, is Venus hotter than Mercury? And if so, yes, Venus is hotter than Mercury. Mercury is not the hottest planet in the solar system. Venus is. And the reason, so Mercury goes through big extremes. It goes about 200 degrees during the daytime and minus 100 degrees in the nighttime. So Mercury has big swings. Venus is always 460 degrees, and that's because the heat is trapping it in. So think like an esky or an oven. The heat is trapped inside, and the heat stays inside. It just gets hot and hot and hot. So that's why Venus is hotter than Mercury. So that's a great question. Mercury is not the hottest planet. Venus is. But Mars also has quite different changes in temperature. So not only do you think there was water on the surface of Mars, Mars is quite interesting. The atmosphere is very different on Mars. It's a lot weaker, so there's a lot less air on Mars than there is on Earth. There's about a third the pressure, as we say. It's also about a sixth the gravity. So you really would feel a lot lighter running around on Mars. It actually means if you go to Mars, you can jump higher. If you go to Mars right now and jump, you can jump way higher than you can on Earth. I think that's kind of cool. But the problem that Mars creates is you get big changes in temperature. So it could actually be a 20-degree difference between your feet and your head. So your feet could be, say, 20 degrees and your head could be freezing. Imagine that. Imagine how big of a change there is just on Mars. So Mars is also very different compared to the other planets. Now, some of the rovers that we've been sending have been exploring this, and this is taken from one of the rovers on Mars. And lots of the rovers on Mars have gone to different places. But one of the things that we see is from space. We have probes going around Mars, and what we see is Mars has a north and south pole just like Earth. It is a frozen cap. Now, this isn't just water. A lot of this is actually frozen carbon dioxide trapped in the North Pole and the South Pole of Mars. We see it change. So just as on Earth, we have the summer, and so the ice melts in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, depending on where summer is, and then it freezes again. This also happens on Mars. But the question is, does Mars have liquid water? Does anyone know? Well, the answer is it does. There is liquid water on Mars, but it's underneath the ground. You have to dig down to get it. So if you dug about 1.5 kilometers, if you had a big shovel and kept digging and digging and digging, you would eventually find water. Now, it's actually salt water. It's very salty, but that's like our oceans. And because of this salt water, it's able to stay in the liquid form, so like you would have as a water. So there are giant pools of water underneath Mars. And this raises the question, is it possible to live on Mars? Well, we wouldn't be able to live on Mars in the same way. You would have to build things that kept you in bubbles, in sealed houses, because you can't breathe the air. The air on Mars is 95% carbon dioxide. That means you could breathe for about 5 minutes and then you run out of air. It's also the big changes in temperature. So if you built special places, so what we call habitats, you could potentially live on Mars, but you wouldn't be able to walk around outside. You would have to always have a spacesuit. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk a little bit more about what it might be like to live on Mars, because there's lots of things that happen to your body. Because in fact, your body, if you can jump higher, you will get a little bit taller on Mars. You get a little bit taller going into space. You can grow upwards of 5 centimeters going into space. You almost stretch out. So lots of different things happen to the human body in space. But there's also some really cool things about Mars that I like. And one of them shows this. So this is what daytime also looks like in Mars. Again, you see dust, sand dunes. You also see a red sky. But because the air is different on Mars, sunrise and sunsets are different. So here on Earth, we have a blue sky during the day, and that's because the makeup of our Earth's atmosphere, the nitrogen and oxygen there, scatter, as we call, or bounce colors of light around, so that only the blue light really comes to the Earth. The red light bounces away. But at sunrise and sunset, more of that red light comes in. So we get red and orange sunrise and sunsets. On Mars is different. So on Mars, it's red during the daytime, and sunset and sunrise is blue. It is very different on Mars compared to Earth. I think it's really cool. So this is an actual photo Mars Curiosity saw of the setting sun. I think that's great. Can you imagine waking up and seeing a blue sunset, or going to sleep and seeing a blue sunset, or waking up for a blue sunrise? It is a very different place. Now, because of this, Mars has very interesting things. So we have in our Earth, if you remember, we have this giant magnetic bubble that helps protect us from sunburps. Mars's magnetic bubble is a lot weaker. And because of that, we think the sun has changed the landscape of Mars, and it's actually changed the way the surface is. We think maybe the sun helped boil off or helped the water escape on Mars. So we think a while ago, billions of years ago, Mars looked really similar to Earth with giant oceans on the surface. But over time, because it had that weak bubble, it didn't get protected. And over time, the surface of Mars changed. Now, the inside of planets are always a little bit interesting. And we'll talk about this with Jupiter and the gas giants in a second, because it might surprise you what's in there. The biggest thing I also think that surprises people on Mars is the cool thing, and that is it has a giant volcano. So this is called Olympus Mons. This is the biggest volcano in the solar system. It is 500 kilometers wide. It is bigger than Tasmania. It is bigger than France. It is so high, it sticks out of the atmosphere. You couldn't even fly over it in an airplane. You'd have to fly all around it. It would take you 5 hours to get across it if you're driving in a car. This thing is giant. Now, one of the things that's recently been studied is what's happening on Mars, and that is Marsquakes. So you don't have earthquakes on Mars because it's not Earth, it's Mars, but it's kind of similar. Now I'm gonna play, this is what a Marsquake sounds like. So what you'll see is we'll hear some wind on Mars, then we'll hear the rumbling of a Marsquake, and then we'll hear the robot playing. So here's the wind. Now we're about to get to the Marsquake. There's the rumble. We'll get a bit quieter. And then we'll kind of hear the robot arm at the end. Now, scientists have detected hundreds of Marsquakes. Now, Marsquakes actually last a little bit longer. There's a robot arm moving on it. It kind of sounds cool. It kind of sounds like my stomach when it's hungry for lunch. Now, it's really cool to hear this. Now, it's very subtle, and I know it's a little bit quiet. Now, you can go and search for this and actually hear it on yourself and actually turn up the volume and hear these cool Marsquakes. But one of the things means is that living on Mars is a bit different than here on Earth. The quakes are a little bit longer, so you'd have to build structures that last longer. So it's not just the air that looks differently, like the red and blue. So in fact, the reason the sun looks blue and the sky looks blue is the same reason the sky is here on red. And that's all because of the way the atmosphere or air is bouncing colors around. So you can actually kind of do this for yourself. You can create a little, if you get a little magnifying glass and you can see how it reflects, or see water going through, or sun going through a water cup, you can actually see how the colors change. So this really happens with our atmosphere. So every planet has a little bit different sky. Nighttime, though, is pretty much the same. On Mars, you could see stars. So you can see out into the nighttime sky. It looks not too different than here on Earth, except you see Earth in the sky as opposed to Mars. So I really like Mars because it has lots of cool things going on. But it also has 2 moons. Now, Phobos and Deimos are these moons of Mars. They're tiny. They're only about 20 kilometers wide, so they're only about the size of a city. And we think they might have been asteroids that got too close to Mars and Mars sucked up. But these moons are getting closer and closer to Mars. And we think maybe in 20 million years, they will get too close, and so the gravity of Mars will rip it apart. And then Mars may actually have a ring system just like Saturn. Now, Jupiter. Jupiter is a really big planet. It's really cool. You can fit over 1,000 Earths inside Jupiter. Now, Jupiter, you can see in the early morning sky. So if you go out in the early morning right now, you look towards in the sky, where right now, similar to where the moon is tonight, you can see three bright objects, dots. They look like stars, but they're actually Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. So Jupiter's quite big. It has a lot of cool things going on. Now, someone asked this, what's inside Jupiter? You can't fly straight through it. You would actually hit something. There's what we call a solid core inside Jupiter. So it's a solid ground inside Jupiter that if you flew all the way through, and you can manage getting all the way through, you would actually smash into it. So there is a lot of gas, there is a lot of atmosphere there, but you won't make it all the way through. You would hit this solid ground. So it's a really, really thick atmosphere with a really solid core. So it's actually quite big. Now, one of the most famous things on Jupiter is the Great Red Spot. So I know someone was just asking about this, so good timing. The Great Red Spot is a giant storm. It is a cyclone. And this cyclone has been going on at least since 1880. So some astronomers spotted it all the way into 1880. Now, at that time, the storm was about 5 times the size of the Earth. So you can put 5 Earths side by side and fit it in the red spot of Jupiter. Now we measure it to just under 3 times the size of the Earth. So about 3 Earths wide. So it's shrinking. So we think just like storms here on Earth, they may eventually go away. So we think in maybe a couple hundred years, the Great Red Spot may stop, just like storms here on Earth stop. It's not the only cyclone it has. In fact, at the North Pole of Jupiter, the Juno probe saw this. And if you see here, there's a bunch of cyclones swirling around. There's about 20 cyclones all going around. These are still quite big compared to the cyclones on Earth, but it's ammonia. So it's a very interesting kind of chemical that we use here on Earth to clean things sometimes. But here on Jupiter, it's as a gas and it's swirling around this giant storm. So Jupiter's a really interesting place in terms of its air, its atmosphere. But what's even more interesting, I think, about Jupiter are the moons of Jupiter. Now, one of the most famous ones is Europa. Now, Europa, we think, is a giant ice water world. So on the outside, we see this icy crust. And you can see these lines. They look like cracks in the ice. And we think underneath the crust of Europa, we think the crust is quite thick. We think there's a giant ocean. And in fact, we think there's so much water in Europa that there would be there would be more water on Europa than on Earth. So I know there's some questions coming in. So if you want, yes, just ask questions in the chat. We'll try and answer them as we go, and then I'll answer more at the end. But just type it in the chat, in the Facebook chat. So one of the great things about Europa is it has so much water. We sometimes see evidence of this water seeping out, as you see here. And so we think Europa may be able to support life. We may be able to think that there's things living on Europa, but just in the oceans, underneath the ground. Now, this is a really cool video. So this is from Juno. And what we see here are 2 of the moons of Jupiter. And you can actually see the phases. We talked about phases last week. And the phases are slowly changing as they go around Jupiter. You can see the Great Red Spot of Jupiter. And you can see how this changes over time. In fact, I think this video is separately on the Facebook page. You can see it. But you can see how big some of these moons are and also how big the Great Red Spot is. Now here's Saturn, and we're going to talk about Saturn in a second. This is Titan. So Titan is the largest moon of Saturn. And you can see the rings of Saturn, how thin they are. Now, the reason I wanted to show this is the moons are really special around these planets. Now, Saturn, well, Saturn's quite cool. Obviously, we all know it has rings around it. But what are the rings? Well, they're little bits of rock and ice. And when you see the gaps in the rings of Saturn, you see little moons. I'm going to show those in a second. Now, Saturn, as of recently as last year, has the most moons in our solar system now. There are 82 moons that go around Saturn. Jupiter only has 79. So Saturn is currently the leader in how many moons it has. But Saturn, just like at the North Pole of Jupiter, we saw those cyclones. Jupiter has it, or Saturn has its own storm. But this storm is shaped like a hexagon. You see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a really odd shape. But at the center here, using the Cassini probe, they zoomed in on it and they saw this giant cyclone. This is fierce cyclone going around, and it looks really ferocious. The winds are thousands of kilometers fast, and it's swirling around at the North Pole of Saturn. So Saturn isn't just interesting for its rings, it's also interesting for what it has on it. But the rings obviously are what most famous. And here's, again, another picture from the Cassini spacecraft. So we see the rings here, and we see this gap in the rings. But at the center of this gap is a little dot, and these are called shepherd moons. So these are little moons that where ice and rock has been collected to form really tiny moons, maybe not even a kilometer. They're really small. And that's why Saturn actually has lots of moons. So not only does it have all the moons that we can see, but it has all these little things flying around it. And so it's literally just the stuff that can make up new moons. And that's why Saturn's rings are the way they are. But Jupiter also has a small ring system. And as you'll see in a second, so does Uranus and Neptune. So in fact, all 4 gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, all have rings around them. It's just Saturn has the biggest rings. Someone just asked, does the cyclone on Saturn get smaller like on Jupiter? So this is a good question. We've seen the red spot of Jupiter getting smaller. We haven't seen this for long enough. So we've only spotted this since the Cassini spacecraft has gone around it to really measure, is it shrinking or not? But we've seen storms change in other planets, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, Saturn also has really cool moons. So this is the moon Enceladus. So this is one of the smaller moons of Saturn. And just like Europa, it has this giant ice sheet. So this is ice, and you can see, again, cracks in the ice, just like Europa. But the Cassini craft saw also get cracks in this ice and gas, almost air, what we call hydrogen gas, leaving these vents, kind of shooting off into space. And we think Enceladus, like Europa, may be another great place that can support life in our own solar system, because we think it has this ice crust, a core on the inside, and in between the core, the solid ground, the solid inside stuff, and the ice, we think there's another ocean. So we think some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn are actually quite rich in the oceans that it has. Now, another moon, this is probably the best moon that people are looking for signs of life, is Titan. So Titan is the largest moon of Saturn. We saw that in that video going around. And this was taken from the Huygens probe, which was attached to the Cassini probe. And it saw an atmosphere, and then it went underneath. So the Huygens probe landed on Titan. What it saw was rivers and lakes. So you can see here, here's a river system, and here's a giant lake. Now, it's not just water, it's water and ammonia, so you can't land and take a drink. But we think that other things can survive on it. So the interesting thing is, if you landed on Titan, maybe there's life forms in the water on the ground. In fact, you can see clouds here. And right now, there's a new mission being built by NASA called Dragonfly, and this is an octocopter. It will have 8 propellers, like a big drone, and they're going to land it on Titan, and they're going to fly it around every Titanian day. And a Titanian day, one day on Titan, lasts 17 Earth days. So it's going to land, do some experiments, then fly, land, do some experiments. It's going to be a really cool thing. So it'll be a really cool way of exploring what's on Titan and maybe does it have life. And someone asked, actually based on last week, now the Earth has a tilt and we have seasons. Do any other planets have seasons? Yes. So lots of the planets have tilts. Mercury does it. Venus has a small tilt. Mars's tilt is pretty much the same as Saturn or Earth. Saturn has a tilt. Jupiter does. Uranus's tilt is 97 degrees, so it has it like this. So the seasons are very different on Uranus because it's spinning like this, which means the seasons last for months at a time. They don't work the same as they do on Earth because a year on Uranus is much longer than a year on Earth. And so the seasons aren't the same because it doesn't spin around the same. So we also think Titan has seasons even because of how it moves around Saturn. And in fact, with the seasons, I'll just go back to this. Scientists have actually seen that this storm slightly changes depending on the season. The color, the air, the elements that it contains slightly changes depending on if it's in the Saturnian summer, the summer of Saturn, or the winter of Saturn. So we can see evidence that seasons affect planets just the same way as they affect our own Earth. So go back to this. So the moons of Saturn and Jupiter are really, really cool. I think this is kind of the coolest looking one, though. This is called Mimas, aka we call it the Death Star. So if you're a Star Wars fan, you may know what the Death Star is. And if you see, it kind of looks like the Death Star. And that's because we think there's obviously lots of meteors, lots of asteroids that have crashed into this planet, or moon rather, to create the craters. And we think one really large one landed here. Now, this image was actually taken after Star Wars built the Death Star. So they didn't model it on this moon. It just kind of is nice that it kind of looks like the Death Star. Uranus. So Uranus is one of the big gas giants on the edge of the solar system. And as you can see, it has rings. It has moons. And someone just asked, do all moons have names? Most. So all of the moons of Earth, because it's called moon. So in fact, there's actually no such thing as moons. They're technically called natural satellites, but our natural satellite is called the moon. So that's why if you ever write our moon, the moon's name down, it should always have a capital M. The moons or natural satellites of Mars are Phobos and Deimos. Jupiter and Saturn, they pretty much all have names. The newer ones, the ones recently discovered, don't. Neptune and Uranus's moons also have names, as well as Pluto. Pluto has moons. Neptune, as I said, is similar to Uranus. They're cold ice gas giants. But one of the great things about Neptune is it has very fast winds. They're the fastest we've recorded. It also has giant storms, so you can actually see a hint of it here. Neptune had what was called the Great Dark Spot, similar to the Great Red Spot of Jupiter, this giant cyclone spinning around. But using the Hubble Space Telescope, we've actually seen the dark spot of Neptune disappear. You've actually seen the storm change. So this really tells us a lot about these storms and these gas giants on the edge of our solar system and what might happen to it. Now, of course, we're going to talk about Pluto. I love Pluto. Now Louise talked about the definitions of Pluto, what it means to be a planet. And we'll talk about it in a second, but Pluto is really interesting. It is not what we expected. This image is from the New Horizons probe, and it really showed Pluto was very different than we thought before the image was taken in 2015. It showed that Pluto has an atmosphere, it has fog, it has mountains, it has ice. It's very different from this. We kind of thought maybe Pluto might have been something like Mercury or some cold, just frozen ice thing. But it's not. It has a lot of interesting things about it. And one of the most interesting things is its moons. Moons are a common theme. And Pluto has technically 5 moons. It has Charon, the biggest moon, and 4 that go around both of those. Now, and this is one of the reasons why Pluto is declassified as a dwarf planet, and that is because Pluto's orbit is a little bit different. And if we look here, most of the planets, or all the planets technically, orbit in fairly nice circles. But Pluto does this very weird egg shape, and it kind of comes in and out of the solar system. And sometimes it's actually closer than Neptune, and sometimes it's further away. And that's actually because it doesn't control its path. So the 3 criteria to be a planet are you have to be round. Now, Pluto is round. You have to orbit a star. Pluto does as well. But things that are round and orbit the stars, we call, but not round, we call. So if you orbit the sun and you're not round, we call those an asteroids. They're shaped like giant potatoes. If you're round, but you orbit a planet, i.e. not the sun or a star, you're a moon. Now, where it fails is does it control its path? Does it control how it moves? And that's because Charon and Pluto are dancing in space. So instead of our moon going around the Earth quite nicely, they dance in space. And so Pluto doesn't really control its path around the sun, and that's why it was demoted as a dwarf planet. It does have ice, and when we look at the composition of Pluto, what it's made up of, it has a lot of iron. The red here is iron. It has lots of other metals and minerals on it. It does have ice, and it does have some atmosphere. So it is very different than what we thought. Um, but when we look at Pluto, Pluto is not alone. It has friends. In fact, some are bigger, like Eris, and it has its own moons. We have Makemake and Haumea. There are actually lots of dwarf planets out there. We keep finding more and more of them every day. We keep finding more and more things, what we call trans-Newtonian objects, things past the orbit of Neptune every day. In fact, one of the more recent ones is called Erikoth. It kind of looks like a snow person thing. When it was found after New Horizons went past Pluto and took these images in January 2019, it saw that these two balls were kind of stuck together, but they're actually not round. They're shaped more like pancakes. So they're kind of two pancakes stuck together. So we don't really know what some of these things are there. It doesn't look like there's have lots of collisions. You don't see a lot of meteor impacts, a lot of craters. They've kind of just slowly, we think, spiraled together until they eventually grew together and almost got stuck. And we think there may even be more things out there. So all of these ones with these really long numbers are new dwarf planets or dwarf planets that have been discovered but haven't been fully classified or have a name yet. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see the bright thing in the center. Well, that is the orbit of Neptune. That's our entire solar system. These things are really far out. And we think there could be another planet out there called Planet 9. And the reason we think that is if we see all these dwarf planets, they're kind of to one side. So imagine you're playing tug of war and you have one people tugging on your one side. Well, the solar system isn't falling over. There must be something else tugging us over here. And that is what we think Planet 9 could be. It could be upwards of 10 times the mass of the Earth. And 1 year on Planet 9 could be as long as 30,000 Earth years. Now, it doesn't mean it exists. We're trying to find it, but we think there are more things out there. And there are even things past that, and we call them comets. And you can see comets sometimes in the sky. This was taken a number of years ago, called Comet McNaught, called the Christmas Comet. Now, if you've heard of things like Halley's Comet, these are some of the famous ones. This is actually what they look like when you get close to them. So this is Comet 67P that the Rosetta probe took an image of. And it's about 2 kilometers wide, and there's cliffs, and it's mostly ice with a lot of dirt and rock. And these things, as they travel through space, the ice melts. And as the ice melts, the sun melts the ice, and that's what we get to see this beautiful tail. And maybe, if it works out in the next couple of weeks, there may be a comet visible with their own eyes called Comet Swan. Swan is the person who discovered it. That's the name. That's how comets are named. So Comet McNaught was named after Robert McNaught. It may be visible, and you might see this bright tail or bright kind of comet nucleus, as we call it, with a little bit of a tail. But we'll see about that. But these comets live on the edge of our solar system in something called the Oort cloud. And sometimes they come through space, and we get to see them. And this is a famous thing that happened in 1994. So we'll just play this video. Now, you see this little bright dot. We'll play it again. So this is taken with a special color of light. So on the right here is a moon of Jupiter. You can see the great red spot of Jupiter. And you see this little flash. That's actually a comet crashing into Jupiter and exploding, Shoemaker-Levy 9. Now, this hole zoomed in with the Hubble Space Telescope with 12,000 kilometers wide. That's gigantic, 12,000 kilometers across. That's the size of the Earth. So comets can be very fast and crash into things. So we do like to find out where they're going and what they're doing. Now, they generally don't crash into many things, and if they do, they crash into Jupiter, because Jupiter acts as like a vacuum cleaner. So there's lots of things in our solar system. But the biggest thing is how big and far away things are. So we're going to do an experiment, and you can do this at home. So what I'm going to do is I have my soccer ball here. Now I'm going to say the sun is now the size of a soccer ball. So how are we going to create our solar system? Now you can choose anything to be the sun, but you want something quite big. So a soccer ball, a basketball, maybe you have an even bigger ball. The bigger, the better, because that will help with some of the smaller things. Now, how do we do this? Well, you can go to the NASA site, and we'll post the link also as well, and it gives you all the information about the different planets. So how heavy they are, how far away from the sun they are, how big they are, their diameter. So I'm going to say the sun is now this soccer ball. The sun is 1,392,000 kilometers across. So the way to do this is you say, all right, that's the sun. That's how big the sun actually is. How big is my soccer ball, my fake sun? Well, my soccer ball is 22 centimeters across. Just grab a ruler, and you can see how big it is. So my sun is now 22 centimeters. So I need to divide the actual size of the sun by my fake sun, my soccer ball. And you get what's called a scale. So that's how big we have to change everything down to, or move apart. So you with me so far? And I'll post this information so you can do this at home. Because it's a really cool activity just to show how big things are and how far away things are. So let's start with the Earth. The Earth is about 150 million kilometers away from the sun. And if our scale, because my sun is now a soccer ball, is this number, I divide the distance from the sun by the scale, and I get this distance in kilometers. So, or I multiply it by 1,000 because we get 1,000 meters per kilometer. And we now get 23.7 meters. So if my sun is a soccer ball, Earth is now 24 meters away. So go to your house, find a ball, put it in the corner of one end of the house, and measure 24 meters away. That is now how far Earth is. We think of Earth as being really close, but it's still actually really far. But what about its size? So Earth is 12,756 kilometers across. And if this is my scale, that's how big it is in kilometers or millimeters. So to put this in a scale, this is my sun, a soccer ball. And Earth, you probably can't even see this, is a mustard seed. So imagine this. This is actually what it's like in space. The sun is a giant soccer ball, and the Earth is a mustard seed. That is how big the sun is compared to the Earth. A tiny mustard seed is the Earth, and the sun is a soccer ball. You can put over 1 million Earths inside the sun. So you can do this with anything around the house. So this is a really great thing. So go to this sheet, find the biggest thing being your sun, and figure out how far away the things are. So you use the distance here from the sun and how big they are. So our Earth is 23.7 meters away. How far is Pluto? Pluto's going to be pretty far away. How big is Jupiter compared to the sun? And you can even go further than that. Why don't you figure out how far away Voyager 1 is? Voyager 1 is the furthest thing we've ever sent into space. And it is currently 22 billion kilometers away. It is really far away. So how far is Voyager? Keeping in mind, Earth is 24 meters away. How far are the comets? So the comets come from a place we call the Oort cloud, which is over almost 2 trillion kilometers away. How far away is that? You probably won't be able to walk it just to give you a clue, but you can figure out how big the scale is. And if you want to go even further, you can go to this. And if you look in the nighttime sky, that you can see this. So look towards the south and you'll see the Southern Cross. And you have 2 bright objects next to it. And we call these the pointers. And the brightest object on the left is called Alpha Centauri. This is the nearest star system to us. How far is Alpha Centauri compared to the sun? Well, it is over 30 trillion kilometers away. So create your own solar system. Take the big thing you can find and use as the sun. Figure out how small the things are. A mustard seed compared to the soccer ball. How far away they are. And you can really get appreciation for how big our solar system is and how far away and distant things are in our solar system. I think it's quite amazing. So we're going to finish off with some questions. Now you can leave at any time. Please feel free. You can leave at any time you want. We'll stay around and answer a few more questions. Otherwise, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll try and answer them after. So is the sun getting closer to the Earth? Well, the Earth's orbit is not perfect. It does change. So, sorry, in the comments of the video, not the chat, sorry. Put in the comment section, not the actual chat video. The sun, the Earth does change with its distance, not a lot. So we talked about last week, the moon's distance from the Earth changes by almost 50,000 kilometers, 43,000 kilometers. The sun and Earth change as well, but not a lot. Now, over time, the sun will grow and it will get bigger, and it'll grow closer to the Earth. But this will take billions and billions of years. Did the Earth used to have rings? We think the Earth may have had rings, and we call that the moon. When that thing, whatever it was, collided into the Earth and a whole bunch of rock and lava came out, it would have created probably a little bit of a ring. It would have looked very differently than the rings of Saturn, but it would have been around Saturn, and it would have, or Earth rather, and would have stayed like that for quite a while. So if you would have seen us at a time, we would have looked very different than what we do now. Is Earth still, mini moon still with us? Some people may have heard that Earth had a mini moon, and I talked about this a little bit last week. Now, mini moons are asteroids that come near the Earth, and they kind of get captured by the gravity of the Earth, and they slowly go around and orbit around. Earth's mini moon is probably gone now. It could still be with us, but we think there may be more mini moons. We think mini moons could be something that happens when an asteroid gets too close, gets stuck going around the Earth, and then goes away. How hot is the sun? The sun on its surface is about 6,000 degrees Celsius. But on the corona, what we call the atmosphere of the sun, it's over 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. So for some reason, the atmosphere, what we call the corona of the sun, is hotter than the surface. It's quite interesting. What is the coldest planet? Neptune's one of the coldest planets. Neptune, because again, Pluto is not a planet. The things further out are quite cold. How far away is the next galaxy? That is a great question. So to put this to scale, the nearest star to us is 4.2 light years away. The next galaxy is over 100,000 light years away. What we call the Magellanic Clouds, those small and large ones. So you can see these with your own eyes, are about 700,000 light years away. So they're much, 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 much further away than even the furthest star. So our whole galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. What is the newest moon in the universe? Well, there's probably moons being made all the time. As planets are made, when new solar systems are made, you're making new moons. There's probably being moons created all the time. How long ago life came on Earth? So we know life started about a couple billion years ago, almost 3 billion years ago on Earth, but that was simple cell organisms. Humans been around for about 2 million years. One of the big questions is, how did life start on Earth? And we'll actually talk a lot more about life and life elsewhere in another session later. Are there any planets that we can live on other than Mars? This is a good question. In our solar system, probably not. The gas giants, we can't survive. Venus would be too hot. Mercury doesn't have an atmosphere. So the best place we look to live on other things in our solar system are these moons, the moons that could be temperate. They could have water or things we can use. They have things potentially we could breathe. So we think the moons of the solar system offer the best chance to potentially live. Why does the moon have no life? Our moon probably has no life because it doesn't really have an atmosphere. It doesn't have a lot of stuff that can support it. We think that maybe the moon could have had some sort of life at some point. We don't have evidence for this. It's a theory. We may have contaminated it as well. Humans have visited the moon, so we may have contaminated it with our life, our bacteria, same with Mars. So this is something we have to be careful about, not contaminating, not spreading our things from Earth to other places. How do planets form? Planets form in a similar way the sun does. They form after the sun. In fact, Eloise talks a lot about this, and Alex tomorrow or on Wednesday on the Mount Sharma Facebook page will talk a little bit more about finding planets. And we'll have a whole session later on actually how planets form, but the stuff clumps together to form giant balls. So very similar way actually the star, our sun, forms. So it's kind of a nice process that happens. We'll take 2 more questions and we'll end it there. Again, you can type more questions later in the comment section of the video and we'll try and get to them. I hope you've enjoyed this. Alex on the Mount Sharma Facebook page on Wednesday, we'll talk about how to find planets. Next week, I'll be talking about black holes, because who doesn't love a good black hole? We'll talk all about black holes and all the cool things you can see. So do things orbit moons? We think yes. We know, or we're pretty sure that we've found in another solar system a moon that orbits a planet, which orbits the sun, and a moon orbits that moon, which orbits that planet, which orbits that sun. They are currently called moons. And is there any planets orbiting Alpha Centauri? So Alpha Centauri actually has 3 stars in it. It has Alpha Centauri A and B, and a third star we call Proxima Centauri. So it's very different from our own solar system. And we know of at least one planet that's orbiting Proxima Centauri. So yes, there are planets in that star system. We think planets are quite common. So our neighbor star could and does have planets around it, and it could potentially support something living on it. We don't know, but at least it's there. So it's really exciting to think about. So thank you everyone for tuning in and listening, and have a good day, and we'll talk to you again. Take care.